Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Ever heard that thing about women maybe getting a little, more emotional or a bit less sharp at certain points during the month?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like this idea that just keeps coming up, sometimes casually, and other times like it's this serious discussion point.
Right.
Remember way back during the 2016 U.S. election,
Mm-hmm.
there were these, undertones in some of the commentary that seemed to question, certain candidates' mental sharpness
Yeah.
and maybe tie it back to her, being a woman of a certain age.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
So that's the very thing we're diving into today, this whole idea that a woman's menstrual cycle messes with her thinking abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today is pretty simple, really.
Okay.
Let's look at what the actual scientific evidence says about whether our thinking skills really go up and down with our cycles.
Makes sense.
And we've got a lot of research to unpack, including a really interesting new meta-analysis that looks at a ton of previous work.
It's really the scale of this new meta-analysis that I find so fascinating. It was published in PLOS One, and they combined findings from over 100 separate studies.
Wow.
Almost 4,000 women took part, completing all these tests to measure different parts of their cognitive abilities at different points in their cycles.
That's wild.
The researchers are from the University of Melbourne, Nanyang Technological University, and Olin Business School, and they wanted to get to the bottom of a really basic question. Does a woman's cognitive performance actually change throughout her monthly cycle?
And for our listeners who I know appreciate getting right to the heart of things, this deep dive should be really satisfying. What this meta-analysis found might actually surprise you and maybe even make you rethink some of those long-held assumptions we were just talking about. So let's get into this study. What was the main reason these researchers decided to bring together and analyze all of this data?
Well, the main point of this meta-analysis was to deal with these myths and speculations that have been around forever about the menstrual cycle and its supposed effects on a woman's cognitive functions.
Right, because there are all these ideas out there that just don't seem to go away.
Exactly. And the research itself actually points out how menstruation has often been portrayed kind of negatively, almost as if it's some condition that weakens our abilities.
Oh, interesting.
So lots of individual studies have looked into this link, but their results have been all over the place, making it hard to say anything for sure.
Right, it's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Yes, and what was missing was a really thorough statistical overview of all that research, and that's exactly what this meta-analysis aimed to do.
Makes sense.
They wanted a strong examination of all the existing evidence across a whole bunch of cognitive abilities to see if there's any kind of pattern.
Okay, so a big picture perspective.
Exactly. And they wanted to account for all the major hormonal shifts that happen during the menstrual cycle.
Right, because those are definitely real and measurable changes happening in the body.
For sure. And what's remarkable is that it seems like cognitive function is pretty robust, possibly because of evolutionary pressures.
Interesting. So, our brains have adapted to keep us functioning well, even with these internal changes.
Yeah, that's the idea. It allows us to maintain performance no matter what's going on hormonally.
That's amazing. So how did they actually combine and analyze the results from over 100 different studies? That seems like a huge task. Can you break down their method for us?
Oh, it was a big one. A very systematic and rigorous process.
Okay, good to know.
First, they did a deep dive into several major electronic databases, the ones that have all the research in psychology and similar fields.
Like what?
Like PsycInfo, PubMed, the Social Science Research Network, EconLit, and the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Oh, wow, they really covered their bases.
They absolutely did. And they used specific keywords related to, menstruation, hormones, and the different phases of the menstrual cycle to zero in on relevant studies.
Smart.
Now, a study could only be included if it measured how well women performed on cognitive tests at very specific points in their menstrual cycles, and those tests had to have objectively correct answers. So it wasn't about opinions or feelings, but about actual performance on tests of thinking skills.
Okay, so they were focused on studies that directly measured how people think. What specific types of thinking skills were they looking at?
They looked at a whole range of cognitive domains that have been explored in previous research.
Like what?
So we're talking attention, creativity, executive functioning, which includes things like planning and problem solving, general intelligence, memory, motor function, spatial ability, and verbal ability.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive list.
It is. And when the original studies had the data, the meta-analysis also looked at both how quickly and how accurately participants completed those different cognitive tasks.
Yeah, makes sense. Looking at both speed and accuracy gives you a much more complete picture of how well someone's brain is working. But with so many different studies, there must have been some challenges in comparing them, right?
Definitely.
I imagine it's like trying to compare apples and oranges sometimes.
In a way, yeah. The researchers themselves talked about several challenges. Many of those original studies only had a small number of participants, which makes it hard to generalize the findings.
Right. The more people you study, the more confident you can be in the results.
Exactly. Plus, there wasn't consistency in how they defined the different phases of the menstrual cycle.
I mean, like how many days they considered to be part of each phase?
Exactly.
Yeah, that could definitely mess things up when you're trying to combine data from different studies.
For sure. And like you mentioned earlier, some older studies just relied on women self-reporting where they were in their cycle, which isn't always accurate.
It's like trying to remember exactly what you ate for lunch 3 Tuesdays ago. You might have a vague idea, but the specifics are probably fuzzy.
That's a great analogy. So, how did the researchers deal with all these inconsistencies across the studies in the meta-analysis?
Yeah, how do you even begin to make sense of all that variation?
Well, they used a bunch of statistical techniques to make it work. For the main analysis, they used a measure called Hedges G to figure out the effect size.
Okay, and what exactly does that tell us?
It's a way to look at the overall trend across all the studies, and it's particularly useful when some of the studies had smaller groups of participants.
So it helps us sort of smooth out the bumps in the data from
Yeah.
those smaller studies.
Yeah, exactly.
Smart.
They even tried to track down missing data from the original researchers to make the analysis as complete as possible.
Talk about thorough.
They really went above and beyond. And when studies tested the same women multiple times during their cycle, that's called repeated measures, by the way, they took into account the fact that those measurements from the same person are not totally independent.
Makes sense.
They had to make sure they weren't accidentally giving those repeated measurements more weight than they deserved in the overall analysis.
Right, because each person's data should ideally be treated as one data point, even if they were measured multiple times.
Precisely. Then, they had to create a standard definition of menstrual cycle phases so they could compare things accurately.
I bet that's tricky.
They mainly used a 5-phase model based on a 28-day cycle.
Okay.
The phases are menstrual, follicular, periovulatory, luteal, and premenstrual. That's basically when estrogen and progesterone levels are doing different things in the body.
Right, those hormones are the key players in the menstrual cycle.
Exactly. And when original studies used slightly different definitions, the meta-analysis team put them into the phase with the most overlapping days.
So, like, if a study defined a phase in a way that kind of straddled two of their standard phases.
Exactly. They'd assign it to whichever phase it overlapped with the most.
Makes sense.
And if the definition was split too evenly between two phases, they didn't use that data for those particular comparisons.
Okay, so they were really careful about keeping things consistent. It sounds like they took a very careful and thoughtful approach to drawing conclusions from such a diverse set of studies.
Absolutely, they really did. They also used what's called composite score methods when a study reported multiple measures within the same cognitive domain.
So, like, if they had different tests that all measured different aspects of memory, for example,
Exactly.
and they combined them into a single, more reliable measure.
You got it.
Clever.
But they didn't stop there. They did a whole series of what are called robustness tests to see if their main findings held up under different conditions.
Okay, what kind of tests?
Well, for example, they specifically looked at studies that only involved naturally cycling women. So they excluded women using hormonal treatments like birth control pills or who had specific clinical diagnoses that could affect their cycles.
So they wanted to isolate the effects of the natural cycle as much as possible.
Right.
Makes sense.
They also reran their analyses using only studies with very strict agreement in their cycle phase definitions, like at least 80% overlap.
Wow, that's strict.
And crucially, they focused on studies that used hormonal confirmation, like blood tests, to verify where women were in their cycles.
That does sound like a much more reliable way to determine someone's cycle phase than just asking them to remember.
Absolutely. They even did a check using a simpler 3-phase cycle model just to see if the big picture stayed consistent.
What were those 3 phases?
Menstrual, ovulation, and the rest.
Okay.
And lastly, they checked for something called publication bias.
What's that?
It's this tendency for studies that find something statistically significant to be more likely to get published.
Oh, so like studies that don't find a big effect might be less likely to see the light of day.
Yeah, kind of. But thankfully, they didn't find strong evidence that this was skewing their results.
So that's reassuring. After all that careful work, what were the main takeaways? What did they learn about cognitive performance throughout the menstrual cycle?
Well, the big finding, and it was pretty clear, is that they didn't find any strong, consistent evidence for significant changes in cognitive performance across the menstrual cycle,
Like at all.
in any of the cognitive areas they looked at.
So no matter what phase a woman is in, her thinking skills are basically the same. That's a pretty big deal, especially considering how much people believe the opposite.
You're telling me. And while some early results hinted at small differences in things like spatial ability, memory, or verbal ability, when they looked at all the studies together, these differences vanished once they did some statistical corrections to account for all the comparisons they were making.
Okay, so it sounds like those early hints were probably just statistical noise.
Most likely, yes. And what's even more telling is that those hints completely disappeared when they zeroed in on the studies with the most rigorous methods.
You mean the ones that used hormonal confirmation to figure out women's cycle phases?
Precisely.
So the better the science, the less likely they were to find any real link between a woman's cycle and how well she thinks.
Exactly. And remember, they specifically looked at both the speed and accuracy of responses.
Right, because both of those matter when we're talking about cognitive performance.
Absolutely. And again, they didn't find any solid differences across cycle phases for either measure in any of the cognitive domains.
So consistently, no matter how they sliced the data, the same message came through.
It did. And this lack of significant findings held up across different subgroups, too.
Subgroups.
Like naturally cycling women and, when they had enough data, women using oral contraceptives. The robustness tests they did just backed up this overall conclusion even more.
Okay, this really does challenge a lot of common beliefs about women and their periods. So what are the implications of these findings? Like, what does this mean for how we think about women and their abilities?
I think the implications are huge, especially when it comes to busting those widespread myths we talked about at the start.
Yeah, the ones that say women are somehow mentally impaired when they're menstruating.
Exactly. These findings say that's just not true. Women's cognitive abilities aren't reliably and negatively affected during menstruation or any other phase of their cycle.
That's a powerful statement.
I think it could really change how women are viewed and maybe even help to break down some of those harmful stereotypes that have been around for so long.
Yeah, like the idea that women are just too emotional to be leaders or make important decisions.
Precisely. And it could reduce the pressure on women to constantly prove those stereotypes wrong, especially in their careers and public lives.
It's like they're always having to work harder to be taken seriously.
Exactly. Think back to that Hillary Clinton example from the 2016 election.
Oh, right.
That was a prime example of these misconceptions playing out on a public stage. This research basically says there's no scientific basis for those kinds of doubts.
That's a really important point to make. So based on this big analysis, there's no reason to limit women's opportunities or question their competence just because they have a menstrual cycle.
None whatsoever.
That's fantastic. But like with any scientific research, we need to consider the limitations of this meta-analysis, right?
Of course, it's always important to acknowledge the limitations.
So what are some things to keep in mind about this study?
Well, while they did try to account for a lot of the methodological weaknesses in the original studies, this meta-analysis is still ultimately based on those individual studies.
Right. It can only be as good as the data it's based on.
Exactly. And as we talked about before, those studies often had issues like small sample sizes, inconsistencies in how they defined menstrual cycle phases, and sometimes relied on self-reporting, which isn't always the most accurate.
Yeah, we covered that.
The meta-analysis team tried their best to address these issues through their methods and all the robustness tests, but those limitations are still there.
So it's not a perfect picture,
Right.
but it's the best we have right now.
Right.
What else?
Another thing is that this analysis looked at pretty broad categories of cognitive function.
Like memory, attention, that kind of thing.
Right. So it's possible that there could be tiny changes in very specific sub-skills within those broader categories that this analysis just wasn't sensitive enough to pick up.
Okay, so like there might be some subtle effects that are still out there waiting to be discovered.
Possibly, yes.
Got it.
And the researchers also mentioned that almost all of the studies they looked at probably involved women from wealthier, developed countries who have regular cycles.
That makes sense. Most research tends to focus on those populations.
It does. So we need more research to know if these findings apply to more diverse groups.
Like women with irregular cycles, different health conditions, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and different cultures.
Exactly. Places where experiences and views about menstruation might be really different.
Right, because culture can have a huge impact on how people experience and understand their bodies.
For sure. Another limitation is that the original studies didn't always have enough detail to really analyze how different types of birth control pills affect cognitive function across a cycle.
Yeah, that's an important point. Different types of hormonal contraceptives can have very different effects.
They can.
And this meta-analysis wasn't really able to tease those apart.
Not really, no.
Okay, so that's definitely an area for future research. What else?
Well, the main focus of this meta-analysis was on cognitive performance, the stuff you can actually measure.
Like how well someone does on a test.
Right.
But it didn't really delve into the biological mechanisms that might connect hormonal fluctuations to brain function.
Exactly. That's a whole other area of research that's super complex.
And finally, in some of the areas where there wasn't a lot of research, the conclusions are based on a smaller number of studies.
Right, so we need more research in those areas with bigger groups of people to be really confident about the findings.
Okay, so even though this meta-analysis is super helpful, there are still lots of unanswered questions and areas to explore.
For sure. Which brings us to what the researchers who conducted this meta-analysis thought about their findings.
Right, their expert opinions.
Yeah.
So what were their main interpretations?
Well, given all the hormonal changes that happen during the menstrual cycle and the fact that there are hormone receptors in the brain.
Meaning the brain is definitely sensitive to those hormones.
Right. They said they were a little surprised that they didn't find more consistent changes in cognitive performance.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you'd think that if hormones are affecting the brain, then there should be some noticeable changes in how people think.
Exactly, but they didn't really find that.
And they had some ideas about why that might be the case.
They did.
What were they?
One possibility is that the hormonal fluctuations, while real, might just be too small or too short-lived to have a big, measurable impact on how people do on these cognitive tests.
So like the brain just kind of shrugs them off.
In a way, yeah. Another idea is that women might, without even realizing it, use other cognitive strategies or ways of compensating to keep their performance stable throughout their cycle.
So like their brains are finding workarounds.
Exactly. And the third possibility is that individual differences in how women respond to hormonal changes might be bigger than any overall changes that happen across the cycle.
So some women might be more sensitive to those hormonal shifts than others.
Right, and that variation could make it hard to see any clear patterns when you're looking at data from a whole group of women.
It's like trying to find the average height of a group of people. When you've got both really tall and really short people in the mix, the average might not tell you much about any individual.
That's a good analogy. The researchers also pointed out that their findings line up with what earlier reviews of the research had found.
You mean the ones that looked at this topic but in a less statistical way?
Right. Those earlier reviews had also generally concluded that the menstrual cycle doesn't have much of an impact on cognitive performance.
So this meta-analysis adds more rigorous evidence to support that idea.
Exactly.
And what did the authors say about future research? What directions did they suggest for scientists to explore next?
Well, they had a bunch of recommendations. First, they said we need more research in those cognitive areas where we don't have as much data, like verbal ability.
Okay.
And they specifically highlighted the need to use more rigorous methods in those studies, like hormonal confirmation of cycle phases.
Right, because the quality of the data really matters.
It does. Second, they really pushed for more consistency in how researchers define and study the menstrual cycle.
You mean everyone should be using the same definitions for the different phases?
Exactly. That includes using standardized definitions and always using hormone-based measures to confirm cycle phases, since relying on self-reporting can be unreliable.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to compare results from different studies if everyone's using slightly different definitions.
Exactly.
So standardized definitions would make it a lot easier to combine data and see the big picture.
Precisely.
What else?
They also emphasized how important it is to include more diverse groups of women in future research. We need to move beyond just studying healthy women in Western countries.
Right, because those women don't represent everyone.
Exactly. We need to include women with irregular cycles, different health conditions, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and from various cultures.
It's really important for making sure the research is relevant to everyone.
For sure. They also said that while their analysis focused on broad cognitive categories, future research could look at those tiny fluctuations in more specific subskills within those categories.
Right, because there might be subtle effects that we're just not seeing yet.
Yeah, that's possible. And they acknowledged a limitation in their own work. They didn't have multiple researchers evaluate every single original study, which can improve the reliability of a meta-analysis.
So they're saying future meta-analyses could do that for even more solid results.
Exactly. They also stressed the need for more research specifically on the effects of different types of hormonal birth control on cognitive function throughout a cycle.
Right, because that's a big missing piece of the puzzle.
It is. And lastly, they emphasize how important it is for future research to go beyond just measuring how well someone performs on a cognitive test and to actually explore the biological mechanisms that might connect the menstrual cycle and cognitive function.
So, like, what's actually happening in the brain at a cellular level?
Exactly. And of course, they said we need studies with larger sample sizes to be more confident in finding any subtle effects that might exist.
Right, because more data always helps. So it sounds like while this meta-analysis gives us a really good overview, there's still a lot more work to be done to understand the complex relationship between the menstrual cycle and the brain.
For sure.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key message you'd want our listeners to take away?
The biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power. The best scientific evidence we have, and this meta-analysis brought it all together, tells us that the belief that women get mentally worse at certain points in their menstrual cycle just isn't true.
It's a myth that we need to stop believing.
Exactly.
That's so important for women to hear and for everyone to understand. It really challenges some deep-seated assumptions. So here's a final thought for you to ponder. If these beliefs about the menstrual cycle hurting women's thinking abilities aren't actually based on good science, why have they persisted for so long?
Good question.
What biases in our society might they be reflecting? Maybe looking into the history and sociology of menstruation can give us some answers. If you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, I encourage you to find and read the original meta-analysis in PLOS 1. It's all about using critical thinking and evidence-based understanding to navigate these common beliefs.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll catch you next time.
See you then.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.